What's the most disturbing secret you have discovered about someone close to you? Story 1. She was my best friend of 7 years. We had literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back to be closer with her after about a year. We had no real ties to the state we had tried out, so we said, screw it. Let's go back. She's basically family. We were also happy to be reunited. She was over almost every night for dinner. We all laughed and talked and had a blast. Best year of my life. Then slowly, she started trying to turn my husband and I against each other. Anytime we had an argument, like any couple does, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan B for us, that if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her and we'd live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her infertility issues and how she wanted to have a kid just like him. She just needed a sperm donor. This all happened at around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts and figured it out. She wanted to take his sperm and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, banging on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was so terrifying and panic-inducing that we ended up having to move and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I had never had a friend like her, only to find out that she cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. But yeah, that's my story. Husband and I are great now. Story 2. I was pretty close with my youngest uncle growing up, at least in pictures. He was in his mid-20s when I was like 5 for context. One day when I was in middle school, he just stopped coming around completely. My entire family told us kids that he was backpacking around the nation. In high school, I was going a genealogy project on my grandfather, his dad, and accidentally found my uncle's name on the sex offender registry. Come to find out, he was running a CP ring and had served 16 years in federal prison. He's out now and my family pretends nothing happened. I stay far away. Story 3. A work colleague appeared on the front page of a national newspaper for a life of fraudulent qualifications. He claimed medical and law degrees, was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, and was the CEO for a major Heath fund. He actually was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, but that and the Heath Fund role were largely built on the fraudulent qualifications and a progression of jobs also based on this claims. In reality, the only qualification he actually held was as a mortuary assistant. Not even his wife knew. The fraudulent degrees had been gained when he was in the Army Reserves recruiting and he had access to submitted position applications. He came undone when he applied for a government job, and some flags were raised by the recruitment people. He tried to withdraw the application but didn't realize that an application for a government role has the same weight as a statutory declaration and cannot be withdrawn. It all went south very quickly and he ended up doing jail time. Story 4. When I was 17, I dated someone who told me when he was drunk that not only would he probably hit me one day and just wanted me to be prepared, but he also used to rape his little brother. Every now and then I remember that moment and it just floors me how dangerous that kid was. Story 5. I found out that my aunt, who was 13 at the time, was raped by her uncle, my great-uncle, and had a baby in a cellar in the basement of her house. The baby didn't make it, so she and her little sister buried it there. Years later, when the aunt, who had repressed those memories, had a baby, she remembered it all. When her family found out, she was labeled the slut of the family. My dad's side is garbage. Story 6. Found a scrapbook of my mom and a guy I didn't recognize from her immediately post-college days. Turns out he was a long-term boyfriend of hers who killed himself when she broke up with him. My grandfather found his body. I learned at age 20 by finding the book/shrine to him. Story 7. When my grandfather passed away, we discovered that he did not exist. His name was not in any government registry. He was a normal citizen, paid taxes, had a license, and everything. Lived a long life, married to my grandmother for over 50 years, had multiple children, everything normal. Still to now, no one knows who he really was and why he had a false name. Story 8. My mom received birthday cards with money in them for years from her parents. She kept the cards with the money in them, saving to buy a piano/sentimental reasons. My sister, who has repeatedly stolen from family members, found the collection of cards and money and took them. My mom only wanted the cards back when she realized what happened. My sister denied everything. Story 9. I remember one kid in my classroom that stunk. His clothes were always ratty, and everyone laughed at him and ostracized him. He was a big kid, and despite his size, he never acted out, except once in the middle of class when a teacher told him, in front of everyone, that he needed to shower. It wasn't until I was an adult that I found out how neglected he had been. I try to tell my kids to be nice to anyone who is different. We don't know what their story is, and differences are what make us unique. This wasn't just a stinky kid. It was a kid raising himself. Story 10. I found out that the reason why one of my uncles didn't want to go back to Korea when he retired was that he couldn't. He was fearful for political reprisals if he tried to return. Turned out his brother was part of the group that assassinated the Korean president back in 1979, and his own innocence was never proven, so he was in fear of getting arrested if he ever tried to go back. Story 11. I wasn't close to this person, but I did hang out with them a few times. The best man at my wedding had another really close friend who turned out to be a serial killer. It messed him up really badly. He already had mental health issues, and this sent him over the edge. I can't even talk to him anymore. I miss you, man. Story 12. Met a super nice guy at a networking event when I just starting out in tech. He had a ton of connections and was a nice family man. Super rich. Eventually, we became friends, and he was acting as a mentor figure to me in the industry. Went over to his massive new house, met his family, etc. He had the demeanor and looked like Al Borland from Home Improvement. To give you an idea, like 4 years later, I was looking at the sex offender registry map for my local area while I was shopping for houses. Lo and behold, his house popped up. In the early 2000s, he was convicted of co-running a commercial CP sale site. Served 5 years for it in federal prison. Story 13. After my husband died in 2020, I found out he had been having an affair with a 30-year-old. He was 55. She apparently aborted his baby. Everything he told me about his prior life was a lie. Second marriage for both of us. And he had been having sex with men since he was in his early 20s. To sum it up, I didn't know this man at all. We had been together 10 years and married for 6. Story 14. My brother was stealing money from father who had dementia. This went on for a year, and I found out about it. It was because the bank who had my father's mortgage called me wondering why it hadn't been paid in 6 months. My father's bank account went into the negative around this time too, and when I confronted my brother about it, he said, "Well, I gotta pay my bills." I was about to take control of all the accounts and make sure shot got back on track, but my father ended up in the hospital and died shortly after that. My brother also stole some of my inheritance too. In the end, he stole over $5,000 from his dying father. Story 15. One night as a kid, I heard my parents having an explosive argument in their bedroom, which suddenly went quiet. The door was closed and locked. I found out during a drunk phone call from my mother. It was because she attempted to shoot my father in the face with a .303 rifle, but it didn't go off when she pulled the trigger as there were no bullets. They were both horrified and just stared at each other, apparently. They're still together. Story 16. My grandfather beat someone to death. My dad was an only child, but my grandmother was once pregnant with my dad's younger brother. When she was 6 months pregnant, someone in construction equipment ran over the car she was driving and she lost the baby. While she was in the hospital, my grandfather found the guy and beat him to death. From what I understand, he was in jail for about a week before he was released. Apparently, He claimed temporary insanity due to the circumstances. I learned all this about 4 years ago when my brother was researching family history and asked my grandfather about it. I've always seen him as a nice little old man. Story 17. Discovered that my sister stole my father's $25,000 Rolex not more than 24 hours after he died. I only discovered it when her and her husband made a frivolous purchase, and I wondered where they got their money since they were always broke and begging my parents for money. I got suspicious. It hit me that she might have stolen and sold the Rolex, had the paperwork, ran a track on the sales history, and discovered it had been sold to a pawn shop down the street from where my sister lives. Went to the pawn shop, and after a bit of persuasion, got them to tell me who sold it to them, and it was my sister. Me and my mom disowned her. Story 18. Just found out the other day that it wasn't my neighbor's dad who senselessly shot and killed my dog. It was his son, who I was close friends with. He did it on purpose. He knew how much that dog meant to me too. I also found out the other day where he lives. He's a meth head now, so I'll just let nature or the police do their thing. Story 19. I said something in general about horses one time. My good friend just kind of shrugged and said, "Huh, my uncle got fucked to death by a horse." What the hell? Turns out my friend's uncle was the Mr. Hands guy from the Seattle area. My friend was like, "Oh yeah, there's a whole movie about it and everything. It's called Zoo. Some town called Enumclaw. Washington is where this happened." I did look it up to see what he was talking about, since he just blindsided me with the whole story. I don't really know why someone would claim such a thing if it weren't true, but perhaps he just wanted to shock me. We don't really communicate anymore due to changing jobs. Story 20. I don't know how disturbing this is. It turned out pretty fantastic. But elements are disturbing. I was adopted and told a silly magical story about my birth parents that most certainly did not seem true even when I was a child. At 57, I learned I was the result of a college affair between a very seriously Jewish young man and a very Baptist young woman. She was rushed off to a home for wayward girls to give birth. He followed her there, many states away, begging her to keep me and live a life together. But their families both said absolutely not. Jewish people were not viewed as white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her marrying a non-white. Plus, she was a very committed Christian and did not want to convert to Judaism. So off I went. Into another family. I recently discovered 3 lovely half-siblings, and we are all pro or semi-pro musicians and get along well. I never got to meet my mother. She died a year before I searched. My father is out of the picture and wants to be left alone. And I'm fine with that. I'm grateful for the love he gave me. It was enough. Another person that was in my non-bio family was also adopted. She was a little older than me. Struggled with some mental illness issues. She tracked down her mom later in life, too. She was in a hospital and had been since the day she was born. She was born holistically disabled. Physical, mental, cognitive, learning, sensory, and was raped by an orderly, and she discovered she was the result. Endings to our searching are not always happy,